So I'm going to just talk about gamification and in particular about loyalty, but I might veer off a little bit and talk about gamification in general, considering I have a little extra time today than I thought I had. So the first thing I want to do is define loyalty, because I think this is a word that comes with a lot of assumptions. I mean, obviously this is loyalty world, but there's more than one topic at play here. So really just kind of want to get my definition of loyalty out here, and hopefully this kind of syncs up with a general understanding. But so loyalty is an attempt to increase things like, specifically things like registration or brand relationship, stickiness, time on site, sharing, etc. It's kind of an interaction between the brand and the user. And at a higher level, more broadly, I think you could define loyalty as return business, a deeper, better business, and then maybe things like user advocacy and content creation, depending on the type of business you're in. So hopefully this makes sense. I'm not doing anything radical with my definition of loyalty. And part of the reason for this is I think I'm going to kind of take a very different approach to a loyalty program than what's considered kind of the normal understanding of a loyalty program. So the established response, kind of to start first with what a loyalty program is right now. I think it kind of started with this concept of like a stamp card. Really, so get 7 stamps, get your 8th sandwich free idea. And you got this evolution into rewards programs with points and miles and things like that. And it's kind of got to the point now where everyone's got one of these, and you need little programs just to manage all of your miles. And you even have things like converters. It's almost like the Forex at this point. You have all these currencies that you can exchange between. And in some ways, I think it's starting to kind of lose the point of a one-to-one relationship between a specific brand and the user. So traditional loyalty programs face some issues. People are starting to get a little bored with them. The first reason is obviously the novelty is gone. If everyone's got one, they've been around for a while. Lack of competitive differentiation is an interesting one for me. Sometimes they're not all created equally, but the user doesn't necessarily know that. And I know personally I've had bad experiences with some where they just don't seem to provide value, and I tend to blanket, apply to all of them. They don't provide necessarily that much value. And I've heard a lot of people say that it's really not about redeeming the points anymore. It's really just about the privileges associated with it, which is kind of putting all your eggs in one basket. It's expensive. You need to give the user something, so these loyalty programs. So there's certainly a large cost baked into it. I kind of talked about this a little bit, but diminishing value, things like blackout dates, restrictions. The users are starting to associate these things with limited value. And in general, it just is starting to feel a little stale. So the question is, are there alternatives? If we were to take a big step back, are there other ways of approaching this? So learning from games. My background is in games. And an interesting thing about being in games is that games are really engagement machines. Games have been evolving the concept of fun and engagement really rapidly for the last 40 years when video games came into play. But really for the last 2,000 years, games have been evolving, building on previous games to make new experiences that are even more engaging and interesting to the user. So these modern games are very highly engaging. They've kind of evolved like these animals. And a lot can be learned by observing these things from the wild. So my background, I never actually got into core console games. Like every kid, I wanted to get into that, but I ended up kind of on the periphery of that with mobile games. So I was taking something with a very limited capabilities and trying to recreate these experiences on it. And then when social games came out, I went over there. I worked at Zynga and played them. And it was this other kind of atypical environment where you're trying to recreate the game experience. And gamification is just kind of taking that one more step. But all throughout my career, I've been observing games, trying to figure out what they're doing. And I've thought about this a lot, and I've come up with a lot of stuff. But to make it simple, I think it's easiest to break down what makes a game engaging into these kind of 3 broad categories, and I'll step through these. So your first category is fantasy, and this is things like imagination, storytelling or narratives, and role-playing. And then in the second bucket, we have choice. And choice is things like strategy, control over something or situation, self-expression. These are things that have to do with personal choice, user choice. Then finally, we have this concept of growth. Games are a place where you feel like you're getting somewhere, you're growing. And this is so very literally, it's learning, it's overcoming challenges, building social connections, expanding your social graph, and order, which is possibly the hardest to explain, but it's just this kind of general concept of things making sense and being in this orderly format and kind of systematically approaching problems. And I wrote that this is a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because there's a lot to choose from, and it's a curse because there's a lot to choose from. There's a lot to dig through when you're trying to take what games are doing and apply them to your business problems. So I'm going to take you through an example and just kind of address these three. Hopefully everyone's familiar with the board game Monopoly. So when I talk about the fantasy, what is the fantasy appeal of Monopoly? It's pretty straightforward. It's I'm rich, I'm powerful, I'm a tycoon. These things probably aren't true. It's probably a fantasy. When you step into the game world, you're this rich real estate tycoon. So the choice in Monopoly, they're pretty simple, but if you played the game, you probably had a thought similar to this, is do I trade Pennsylvania for Marvin Gardens now, or do I hold out and try and get Pacific later? And when a kid plays this game, it's probably even simpler. It's, do I want to be the dog or the race car? But the fact is, there's choices in here, and it gives you some degree of control. And then finally, we have growth. The growth stories in Monopoly are pretty literal. So for one, you're knocking your rivals off one at a time. Kind of very literal model. You're watching your fortune amass. You're actually having the little paper money build up in front of you. A really good feeling to see that money increase. And then finally, you're literally growing houses and then converting them into hotels. So it kind of covers all three. And a lot of games cover all three of these. You got your fantasy, you got your choice, you got your story of growth. And all these things are appealing, and you bring them together, you got a very compelling experience. You may say that Monopoly bores you as an adult, and it's probably actually that choice aspect. It's kind of thin on choice. The more you play it. So gamification. So if games can do all this, or games have all this, how do we actually apply this in the real world, and specifically here into a loyalty program? And what does that look like? And I'll say not like this and not like this. This is, if you went here, I don't blame you, everyone goes here. These are games. So on the left, we have a reskin of a popular game called Badgeville. And in this case, they've reskinned it with fruit, because presumably the brand is fruit themed. And on the right, we have an avatar builder. So you're doing something in the experience, and you're earning points or whatever, and you're buying clothes for the avatar. And the problem with these two things is they're a change of context. Gamification is not literally bringing in a game. So games contain their own goals, objectives, metrics, and rewards. And your activity contains its own goals, metrics, behaviors, and rewards. And you want to respect those existing the existing objectives and the existing metrics. So a game is really all about changing the context. You don't want to change the context. So if you think about it, or I like to say it's the quickest way to kill credibility with your audience. And if you imagine sticking Bejeweled into your loyalty program, that's probably where your brain's going to go too, is what is this doing here? It's out of context. Another way of thinking this is if you're trying to gamify the workplace and you were to stick an Xbox in the break room, did you gamify work? The answer is no, you didn't gamify work. What you did is you gave your employees something else to do. They might spend more time in the office, but it's not really beneficial time for you. So it's all about choosing carefully. We have all these things that games do, but we want to be cognizant of what's going to translate over and what's not. So if I address each of these one at a time, so when we look at fantasy, this is probably the biggest no-no, because fantasy is all about escapism. It literally is changing the context. You don't want someone pretending that they're somewhere else doing something else. You want them focused on, the loyalty program is going to carry some weight if it's tied to reality. It's pretty simple. So maybe you skin something, not like the game, but if you were to have a jungle theme or whatever, but it has to be very light, right? It doesn't deeply integrate when you're talking about fantasy, or you're just going to ruin your context. Choice is an interesting one, because choice is extremely important. If you look at the psychology of motivation, people want to feel like they're empowered. They want the sense of autonomy. So the real key point here is take the existing choices. So in a loyalty program, why is the user choosing to interact with your brand? What value are they getting out of that? You need to start with that and focus on that. And you want to make sure you don't introduce new choices. So if you're adding something that feels like a game to the point that they're making choices that have nothing to do with the original reason why they came, you've gone too far. And finally, we have growth. And growth is really the pot of gold. This is where the greatest opportunity to steal from what games are doing and apply it other places exists. So we'll get into that one in a little bit more detail. So I like to say that life is a story of growth. If you, a little too quick. If you ask people what gives life meaning, or you talk to old people near the end of their life, they'll generally tell you things like, it was the experiences, or it was the people I knew, or it was the things I accomplished. And they really fit into these 4 buckets. And it turns out this is exactly what games are tapping into, too. So people, or I should say broadly, all of these things appeal to all people to some degree or another. But some people are more specifically keyed into some of these more than others. So people that find value in learning, these are people that like concentrating, they like solving puzzles. They like this sense of accumulating knowledge, right? Life is this quest for understanding and knowledge, exploring the unknown. When you look at overcoming challenges, these are people that are very goal-driven. It's really all about the challenge, overcoming this obstacle and defeating it. They like the thrill. They like respect. When you look at social connections, this is really broadening your social graph. It's the people you know. It's the relationships. And most importantly, it's your role in this larger group. What do you have that bonds you to these other people? And then also, what do you have that makes you unique? What value do you provide to the group? And then finally, we have this concept of building order and finding order. The way to think about this is, life is this big chaotic thing. People want to try and make sense out of this, and it takes different forms. It may be this concept of, right versus wrong and faith, or it could just be this sense of purpose or being part of a larger machine that's accomplishing something. So really, these are the 4 forms of growth, and I want to look at what these look like in different contexts. All right, out of order. First, I want to talk about one more form of growth, which is extrinsic motivators, and this is actually where most loyalty programs are right now. There's not necessarily a right or wrong between the two, but this is really an artificial form of growth in that it's saying you're tracking towards some sort of objective, but we're defining what that is externally, right? It's something that gives you some sort of monetary value. It's some sort of exclusive privilege. And so what are the difference between these two? If we think of growth as intrinsic rewards, these are things that say something about the user, say something meaningful, they tell some sort of story, the 4 that we just went through. But sometimes there isn't a story of growth. Like if you go to that sandwich shop example, there's really not much you can say about intrinsic motivations with the user. Another case is maybe the user doesn't know the intrinsic value. So how do you motivate them or get them into a system that they don't see the value yet? This is another case where you're going to need some sort of artificial form of growth until they can pick up on the intrinsic form of growth. And then finally, you may have a case where your users have basically achieved everything intrinsically that the system can offer them. They're at the top. They've proven, whatever form of growth they were pursuing, they've kind of maxed out on that. This may be a situation where you provide something extra, some sort of, thank you or bonus on top of what was already motivating. So I've kind of already defined them, but extrinsic rewards are really your tangible rewards. And I want to say as a warning, when you go straight to extrinsic rewards without first investigating the intrinsic story inside the experience, you're basically sending this implied message, which is the experience isn't inherently valuable and you need to be bribed to interact with it. That may not be completely cold and clear, but that's kind of the implied message is that you need something extra to give it to you to interact. Now we'll do the comparison. So I'm going to go through 3 activities and kind of address the forms of growth, so the 5 forms of growth. And I've scaled the font size to correspond to the amount of emphasis that the designer put into that particular form of growth in this activity. So if we look at a redemption card, so the user's earning points that they can then spend, it's really all about that extrinsic. There's a little bit of the building order and a little bit of the challenge. The challenge may be in that I'm trying to hit a particular points total or I'm trying to get a particular prize. I have some sort of objective. And then the building order is I can actually see my progress towards that objective. So those are 2 things that this program is doing right, and that there's a little bit of an intrinsic value for people that take value out of feeling like there's a sense of order and feeling like they have some sort of objective or challenge to overcome. It's really not tapping into the social connections or the learning at all. So when I look at something like social games are interesting in that it's really huge on the order and the social connections. I'm actually going to bring this one up too. Traditional video games. I actually like to talk about traditional video games first because they kind of came about before the social games. So traditional video games, basically any game from the old arcade games like Frogger and Pac-Man up to Call of Duty and these modern shooters is they're heavily challenge driven. The types of users that get really engaged in these games are obviously the types of users that are really driven by challenges, which is one of the predominant reasons why they were so successful with young males. Learning was a significant aspect of it in that it was a fairly complex system that you had to learn, both the eye-hand coordination, but also kind of outsmarting the machine. So there was a high degree of learning to defeat the challenge. Building order, particularly with the games they call RPGs or role-playing games, there was this sense that as you were getting better, your in-game character was also unlocking new abilities and new powers. So there's a good sense of building order. And then social connections have only been coming about recently with your massively multiplayer online games where people are actually starting to work together. Previously, in core video games, if you had someone else playing with you, they were just another challenge to overcome. Social games are interesting. They kind of flipped it on its head, but it was still something you could call a game. The core video game industry actually didn't like social games very much because it felt so wrong, because the overcoming challenges were almost completely removed along with the learning. Social games are very simple, but what they do very well is there's a very structured approach to it. It's very cyclical. You come into the game, you commit your time, and you make progress. So there's a good sense of order. It's all laid out nicely. And they also, because these were on Facebook, there was this opportunity for social connection. So it was kind of an artificial social connection, but it was there. You were interdependent on other users. You couldn't get ahead in the game if you didn't have people in these what they called gifting loops, kind of mutual codependence. And so, I mean, you can kind of do this for any game. You look at a game like World of Warcraft, it kind of does all four really, really hard, which is why the game is so addictive. So implementing growth. If we kind of look at these forms of growth, how do we actually get these? I still haven't talked about how to actually get them in and use them. One way to think about it or break it down is what we call game mechanics, reputation mechanics, and social mechanics. And really all I'm talking about here are, think about game mechanics as quantifying. So rewards, loyalty programs are already kind of starting to do this, which is identifying behaviors and tracking them. You know, it's really about generating data, tangible data, and then organized goals, and you know, kind of displaying the data back to the user. People like to see and hear about themselves. If you can give them interesting stats about what they've been doing, it's interesting to them. But it really gets interesting when you move over to reputation mechanics, which is really all about qualifying. So once you have this data, what does that actually say about the user? What does it say about what they've, you know, their aspirations? Where are they going? How can you tell a story of growth? So it's concepts like status or, you know, unearthing their aptitude. And then finally, we have social mechanics, which don't even literally come from games. You're really seeing these being stolen from social networks. And the idea here is just connect the users, give people a way to connect to each other so that, you know, they can feel like they're part of this group. So it's really about enabling groups to form and just facilitating connections between people and content wherever possible. So when we look at game mechanics, it's really tapping into this sense of challenges and order, right? Competitions and organized objectives. And then when you look at reputation mechanics, you're actually hitting 3 of these forms of growth. So learning, I like to think of learning more, not learning, but actually your memory. It's one thing to have learned something, but it's really all about remembering that you learned this thing. If you forget it, it's almost as if you never learned it. This is, I think, why a lot of people are so afraid of things like Alzheimer's. It's terrible, right? You forgot all these things you learned. So showing a record of talent is really the interesting part of tapping into the growth form of learning, is a record of what skills you've acquired can be represented within the system. A record of victories is pretty a literal transition from these competitions and challenges kind of then turn into trophies or just things I can kind of look back on and remember the challenges I overcame. And then finally, this kind of record of friends and associates. This is what you're seeing in Facebook, right? You already knew all these people on Facebook or LinkedIn, but the system is really gathering and organizing it in a nice way so you can really kind of make it more literal. And then finally, social mechanics. It's the opportunities to connect. So it's just allowing people to, as many touch points as they can to other users. So in my longer version of the presentation, I kind of walk through literally what some of those mechanics look like. This one, which I think is also pretty useful, is I'm going to pick apart the Yelp website. You might not necessarily think of Yelp as a loyalty program. And what I think is interesting about it is it basically is a loyalty program. They need to keep these users. The thing is, they don't really have anything to give them. I mean, we'll get into it. They do have a little bit they can give them. But I'm by no means a big fan of Yelp, but they do try a lot of things, so it makes them a good example. So I grabbed the part on the top from an inline review, and then the stuff on the right is taken from this user's profile page. I grabbed this user because this is a very active user, so they had a lot of data generated. And I'm going to kind of go through what they did right, what was kind of iffy, questionable, but maybe okay, and then I think what they did wrong, and also where there's some opportunity for improvement. So one thing that I think they did nice was elite status. So the arrow on the left is kind of pointing out the elite status is really being part of this user's profile, right? Every review she writes, that's up front. People know she's elite, right? So this is a challenge, right? Getting this elite status was definitely something that users that are engaged in the system are trying to achieve. What's also interesting is the history. These badges collect, right? So not only is it getting elite status, but it's also kind of a history of how long I've had elite status. Review count and distribution. This is just kind of going back to this idea of the data being interesting. The user probably enjoys being able to see not only how many reviews she's written, but the quality of those reviews. And it starts to kind of tell something about her. How fair is she, for example? So the following mechanic, I think, is interesting. Right? This is allowing you to identify people who, for whatever reason, you value their opinions. So it's going to make it easier for you to reconnect with them. You know, this isn't necessarily a two-way connection, but it's still a connection. You know, potentially they see that you follow them, and they could potentially follow you. So I think following is really interesting, particularly if the system provides enough value that there's, you know, if there's some value in knowing what she's doing, which hopefully there is, right? You're trying to build reputations on this site, then being able to follow her seems like a natural next step. And followers and fans, right? Allowing her to see how many people are following her is going to be a really good ego boost for her, right? It's saying 21 people have said that you're meaningful. They value your opinion. So what do they do that's a little bit questionable? So they have this thing called friend count. I don't know how clear it is here, but I just highlighted following. They also have friend count. I think these two seem kind of redundant. There's potentially a relevance issue. Friending seems more like the kind of thing you would do on Facebook. I don't know how real. I almost wonder if they're trying to replicate Facebook rather than focus on the value offered by Yelp. Friending implies that it's kind of outside of the context of restaurant reviews, which is really what the site is about. So I wonder why they have two mechanics there that do the same thing. So the votes. I think votes is an interesting idea. So this is basically if she writes a review, someone could vote, but they only have three options. They have useful, funny, and cool. I think useful is interesting, right? It's kind of a binary thing. It's either useful or unuseful. But funny and cool seem kind of odd to me. They don't really say much. I think there's an opportunity here to get a lot more specific that they kind of missed. We'll get to that in their suggestions a little bit later. So I think it's kind of the right idea, but I think they really didn't take it in a useful direction. I mean, if you could imagine, let's say that for some reason Yelp was all about comedy, then great. People are coming here to look for funny reviews. They definitely want that funny tag. But it's not a comedy site. Okay, so what did they do that's flat out wrong? I think the compliments was a big waste of space. You see this big colorful thing. When I showed this to people at Badgeville, they thought, oh yeah, look at that. Visually, it's very appealing, right? But it doesn't really, it's like those funny, useful, cool, only one step in the wrong direction. They're arbitrary, and there's really no explanation. Like there's one for hot review and one for cool review. And what's even the difference? And I don't think anyone gets it. It's more of this popularity contest. I bet you she's got so many of these just because she's kind of got an attractive photo there. There doesn't really seem to be any meaningful metrics behind these things. They're totally arbitrary. And I mean, the biggest loss is that this space could be used for something a lot more interesting, which we'll get to. So what do I recommend? First of all, goal tracking. They've got this thing, this elite status they've set up there, but there's no sense of getting halfway there or 3/4 of the way there. It's actually not even really quantified anywhere what you need to do to get to elite status. So they've got this thing I want, but I have no idea how close I'm getting, and it's actually not that easy to get to. So unless you're already so engaged in the site that you're going to stumble on it, you're probably not going to get it. But if they had set up kind of some milestones leading on the way, I can guarantee you they'd have a lot more people doing the behaviors they want. I think food specializations, if you go back to what is Yelp all about, it's mostly restaurant reviews. Wouldn't it be great if I could go to Yelp and identify someone who's an expert in Italian food or an expert in Japanese food? I mean, that to me seems like that should be what they're doing with the votes in the compliments section, is establishing experts. There's certainly a lot more pride in what the system says about you if the system's more specific. If the system has identified me as an Italian food expert, that's great, I can take pride in that. I probably believe it. If I don't believe it, the system is obviously measuring the wrong thing. So I think that's a huge thing they could do to really start to build some more reputation, a record of talent. So qualifying elite status, kind of what I talked about. I had a distinction. I'm remembering what it is now. Kind of what I was just talking about, where elite status is kind of this vague thing. You don't know the progress you're making. It doesn't necessarily say much about you, right? It's just still one metric. If you could get a little more specific about maybe types of elite status, it might be a little more interesting. And more specific review votes. Yeah, so talents. Oh, I think my first bullet was more this funny, cool, useful. Could we get a little more specific? And then on top of that, why don't we just go all the way to food specialties, maybe have one for hotels, because I know they're kind of trying to cover these other areas as well, not just food. So hopefully that's useful. Obviously, not every experience is necessarily going to be as rich and naturally social as Yelp is, but these are certainly the kinds of things you want to be thinking along. I mean, as the web gets more and more social and brands get more and more social, I think you need to think more in terms of this rather than get people onto Facebook. Because ultimately, there's going to be kind of a reckoning with sending your traffic to Facebook. And I think the easy answer of just Facebook and Twitter is social is going to kind of fall apart, and you're going to have to really have more of a strategy of how to establish reputation, how to create a real bond between the user and the brand, and particularly the brand as a community. So that's my talk. I don't know how I'm doing for time. I know we got extra time because of that other talk. Yeah, I mean, if you talk to Badgeville's marketing department, they have tons of customer examples they like to show. Out in the wild, I think a lot of companies are still trying to figure it out. Like I show Yelp as doing some good stuff, but also some bad stuff. In a longer version of this presentation, I also go into the site called Stack Overflow. It's really a programming site. It's not really relevant here, but they're often looked to as being kind of a leader in that they're one of the first companies to do it on their own early on, and they've also tried a lot of things and evolved the process. They go really heavy on the data, really heavy. It's just all stats, because that's what their audience really gets into. Engineers in particular love to just have all the data, telling them all the different aspects of what they were doing on the site. So part of it does come back to identifying your audience. I mean, you do like Google search on gamification, you'll start to find things like Nike, gets a lot of publicity for what they've been doing. There's this initiative that Volkswagen actually sponsored. They get cited a lot, these examples of kind of little fun games, invading reality kind of stuff. I guess the short answer is there's no one great one that I like to point to, like these guys have nailed it. But there's a lot of interesting stuff kind of evolving at the moment.
Any other questions?
Usually someone asks me if this works with old people. Very popular question. Why don't I answer that question? Yeah, it does, but you have to be careful about how you present it. A younger generation is totally fine with this analogy of this being like a game. Sure, make it look like a game, make it feel like a game, doesn't matter. With an older generation, you have to kind of go back to the roots of this isn't anything new. In a longer version of my talk, I do talk about how this is nothing new, right? If you look at like McDonald's Monopoly, that's gamification. You look at military badges, that's technically gamification. Because the term is, what it's describing is basically pretty broad, and you can say, okay, well, that's bullshit. Why do we have to call it this new thing? It's really about the technology. The fact that we have the internet and everything is becoming digital and connected is kind of this revolution that's occurring, why you give it this new name, gamification. But the fact is, recognizing people for their accomplishments and their status is nothing old. So it's really just about how you present it to the end user. Don't make it feel like a game if you've got an audience that thinks games are for kids. That's kind of the short answer and the long answer.
I mean, I have a question over here. So, in terms of, designing for these type of, engagement and really kind of getting the ball rolling? Like, what have you seen to be some of the key challenges to kind of getting people to buy into this? I know you've mentioned the aspect of people don't want to view it as a game, but what other kind of challenges have you seen that for a company that's trying to take more of this approach, they've encountered resistance with their customers?
You mean internal with the company that wants to implement it, or with their end users?
With the end users themselves.
One of the challenges is overdoing it. You always want to start simple because, I mean, basically like a game, you kind of have to learn the rules. So you don't want to overwhelm your users with all these different things. I like to say start with what they value. I think I mentioned that earlier. Identify the behaviors that your users are coming to the site for, and also identify the behaviors that provide value to you as a brand holder. These are kind of your two different buckets. And then start with what they have value. Emphasize that. Let them know that this is a system here that's for them, right? It's just an additional service. It's helping them see the things, it's qualifying and quantifying the things that already give them value. Mm-hmm. And then you kind of start to layer in the stuff, if it is different, the stuff that provides you value, the things that you'd like them to do more of. Sometimes it's a perfect synergy and you don't have to ever go there. Other times, let's say you just want them to spend more money. That's not necessarily their objective. But if you recognize that, particularly if you recognize it in a way that presents it more of the value that they're getting.
Another kind of similar vein question. Now, I know when it comes to certain game designs, you think with the end in mind, like what's the ultimate goal, the ultimate rank. When it comes to kind of designing these things for the end users, do you go in kind of having say like, this is the start point, this is the end goal? Because I'm thinking right now you could, get more active to get to the gold level, then the super gold, and then you just keep throwing in more levels at the top or the bottom differentiation, as opposed to kind of going in flat out saying, here's the beginning of the platform, here are the ranks that we're going to have.
So this is actually a problem games had to deal with, which was early on, games were this kind of standalone box or like a cartridge that you would buy, right? And the game developer didn't touch it anymore. But once you got into these online games, the MMOs and then the social games on Facebook, they became kind of this living thing that had to evolve. So in a lot of cases, it's the same thing when you gamify. It doesn't have to be. I mean, if you look at a traditional loyalty program that maybe has tiers and you want the user to do a certain number of behaviors to get to a particular tier so they get a certain status for, let's say, the next month or the next quarter, if that times out, you don't really need to tune the thing into infinity, right? Because it's basically more of a cycle. It's just kind of a maintenance thing. But if it is more of a program where they're building some sort of persistent reputation, you do have to be cognizant of the fact that there is an end state. And basically, no matter how you balance it, there will be at least one guy that will get there really quickly. So, I mean, we talk about exponential level curves. There's a lot of math that goes into it. Mm-hmm. You're kind of targeting that advocate band, the kind of that upper grade. It depends on the implementation. A lot of the times, you're trying to encompass all of your more casual users that may or may not start to turn into advocates, but you're really trying to be aware of your advocates and make sure that they don't kind of go off the system. But I think I mentioned at one point also, for those people that reach the top of your reputation, that's when you might introduce some other interesting things, kind of some top-level rewards for them, potentially things that have extrinsic value that they could get over and over.
Yeah, I mean, I just know from my own end, I've had friends of mine who play like different online games where they just keep adding levels on to the point that they're saying, when's it going to stop? And obviously, in certain points, you want to keep your customers engaged. I think the question they've had, and even I had, it's like, the whole sustainability angle. Do you go in sometimes with it saying, we're going to go in for a certain period of time, we're going in and we're going to or even blossom this into some other initiative that we can go from a different direction on?
Yeah, and that's the whole big difference between building a platform and a more of a one-off program. You can use gamification to gamify some sort of promotion or something, in which case it has a very clear beginning and end. But I think it's more interesting as this kind of sustainable thing, that's really built into the experience. And in that case, yeah, you definitely need to plan for, going on into infinity.
Does anyone have any questions? I know I've been pitching a few questions to Tony, but if anyone has any questions for their own end of their own experiences, feel free to raise your hand. Otherwise, I do have a softball question to ask in case of anything. With that, favorite board game?
My favorite board game now or
why not?
Throughout life?
Why not? I mean, obviously, you're a senior game designer. You have to have inspiration from the past, the present. Like, what have been kind of the main source of inspiration for your?
There's this game called Diplomacy, that was an old Avalon Hill game. I think, I think Milton Bradley owns everything now, so I think they got it too. But the game had no dice, no luck. It was all about, it was World War I, so you were one of these countries and you were kind of moving your little pieces around the board, and it all came down to getting other people to tell you, agreeing with you, like, I'm going to move into this country, I need you to support me. So it was all about just lying to people and kind of manipulating the other countries. It's a fun game. It takes all day, though.
And what about now? Do you have any game now, or you're good for the most part?
The interesting thing about board games is they're starting to get more of an adult audience again, like games like Settlers of Catan are bringing it back. I don't know how many people actually know what that game is, but it's fun.
All right, with that.
Very good.
Thanks.
Thank you, Tony.